Welcome to the Anatomy and Physiology Study Group with Amy and Annalie. Today we'll be talking about neuron anatomy. Let's start our discussion with just a basic neuron structure so we can identify the pieces that are involved. So with every neuron, we'll start out with a soma or a cell body that contains a nucleus. And then we have a couple of long extensions coming off of this neuron cell body. So let me get those in here and then we'll talk about what those are. All right, so here is the soma or the cell body. And then we have two main functional regions. So this region here, this is the receptive region, and these little tiny branches are called dendrites. Sorry about that. So they make up that receptive region. That means that information is coming into the cell body. And then we have this long region here called our axon. And this is the part that is sending information. So information in a neuron is always going to be flowing in this general direction. From the dendrite end, through the cell body, down along the axon to these synaptic knobs, or the axon terminals that you're already familiar with from our discussion about the neuromuscular junction. Now we can take that same basic structure and we can actually talk about the two types of structural neurons that we may have. What we just drew is called the multipolar neuron, meaning it has many extensions coming off of that cell body. So if we put that together again, here's our cell body, here are the dendrites coming off of the end, and here's the one single axon with the axon terminals or the synaptic knobs. Now remember, in this example, information is flowing from the dendrite end towards the axon terminals. Now the other option, structurally speaking, that we're going to focus on in this class is called the unipolar neuron. And that just means it has a single projection coming off of the cell body. So really, we have the cell body here, and we have this one short axon. But that axon branches, and it goes in two different directions. So let me show you what that looks like. What we end up with is effectively a dendrite end. Let me put that here. Even though these are not literal dendrites that are coming off of the cell body, you can see that the cell body doesn't actually have any dendrites itself. It only has that one axon. But we have an effective dendrite end, which is the part that's going to be receiving the information. And then we have this typical axon. This would be the part that we really think of as the axon like we see above, that has the synaptic knobs at the far end there. So the synaptic knobs, in a sense, are like the distal end of that unipolar neuron. So the direction that information is going to flow in this example is from the dendrite end all the way past the cell body and down towards the very end of the synaptic knobs. So let's just look at these again. So the multipolar neuron has many processes coming off of the cell body, many dendrites, and one axon. The unipolar neuron has one axon coming off of the cell body that splits, and it has a dendrite end at one side and the typical distal end, the synaptic knobs, at the other side. So these are our two structural classifications of neurons. We can also start to get in our discussion about the functional classifications of neurons. I want to go ahead and give you some information here before we jump on to the next slide. So all of our unipolar neurons are going to be what we think of as our sensory neurons. That means that these are coming from a receptor. So there's a receptor associated with this dendrite end. And then that information, like we just said, flows down past the cell body towards the synaptic knobs. This is where that sensory receptor is located. Multipolar neurons are going to be typically found as motor neurons in the functional examples that we're going to talk about later, where you have the information being generated here at the cell body, and then at the end of the synaptic knob would be whatever your effector is, like a muscle in this case, if we're talking about the somatic motor system. So we have the muscle or the effector at the far end of the multipolar neuron. And then the last piece is that, functionally speaking, we also have neurons called interneurons. And interneurons are housed specifically and completely inside the central nervous system. And because of that, they are actually not going to be a part of your nerves, but they are all multipolar neurons in structure as well. So let's hit on that together in just the... All right, so let's take a look at those functional classifications again. We have what we called the sensory neurons, which are all going to be unipolar. We also have our motor neurons and our interneurons, which are all going to be multipolar. Sorry, can't spell. All right, so multipolar neurons are motor and interneurons. Unipolar neurons are sensory. Remember, unipolar has one cell body that's then split with a short axon, and we have a dendrite end, and we have the axon terminals at the far end. Motor neurons and interneurons, they are more linear, where they have all the dendrites at one end and then one long axon that heads out to the effector or towards the next cell in the synapse. Let's take a look if we try to put all these together and see what that pathway would actually look like. All right, so I'm going to try to put this together maybe in an example that we can really think about. Let's go kind of think of an example of maybe let's say we've put our hand on a stove and we've gotten some sensory reception from that. We need to send the information to the brain, and then we want to have some type of effector message, some instruction sent back out to our hand to tell us what to do. So I'm going to put in, we're going to make a spinal cord. Wow, that's crooked. Sorry. And I'm going to make a big brain here, and then here's the spinal cord. And let's think about where these neurons are actually going to be. So let's say here is our hand. That's right. Okay, here's our hand, and we have to start with some type of a receptor that is here in the hand. So we know that a sensory neuron is going to be connected to this receptor. Sorry about that. Sensory neurons, we said, were unipolar. Their cell body is right here, and the axon terminals, the synaptic knobs, enter into the spinal cord. All right, from this point, we're now inside the central nervous system, and if the next neuron is going to stay completely locked inside the central nervous system, what type of neuron structurally are we dealing with now? Well, we should be dealing with a multipolar neuron, right? Because we are inside the CNS. So we're going to have a cell body here that synapses with the synaptic knobs of the sensory neuron, and that's going to take this message up to the brain. Here are our synaptic knobs of our interneuron. Well, that's not as far as the information needs to go. We've got to get it to come back down. So let's say we have another interneuron here that's going to communicate and receive that message, and it now has to carry instructions back down the spinal cord, and it's going to meet up with our motor neuron, again, another interneuron, that will have an axon that comes all the way back out to the same hand, to the muscles there, to send some message, hopefully to say, pick up your hand. So let me change colors a second and start showing you again. Let's go back and label these. 1 second. So let's switch to, we'll say red because we've touched something hot. So this is our sensory neuron. And we said it was unipolar. And that means that action potentials, sensory input, is coming in along this sensory neuron. Now, once we get to that sensory neuron, we're going to switch to our interneurons. Remember, they stay inside the CNS. And that sensory neuron is multipolar, and it's carrying information up the axon. It's going to synapse with another interneuron, and it's going to come back down axon number 2, right? And that's what our interneurons are doing. So our interneurons are multipolar. Okay? And now that information has to now exit the central nervous system, and we've got to get back out towards the effectors, right? We've got to try to save this hand. And so now we're sending action potentials along this motor neuron, again, to the synaptic knobs, which is where the muscle will be located. That will be where a neuromuscular junction is, which you guys are familiar with. So we can see here that our motor neurons are also multipolar. All right, so that's just a review of what the different structural and functional classifications of neurons are and what it would look like if you put those all together in one big pathway. Hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.